Hello, and welcome to Legally Speaking, a production of the Macomb County Bar Foundation and Lakeshore Legal Aid. Today we're talking about elevated lead levels in housing. According to the Center for Disease Control, at least 4 million households have children who are exposed to elevated lead levels. Children who are living in poverty and in older homes are at the greatest risk. Here in Michigan, after decades of reducing lead levels, the Department of Health and Human Services reported elevated levels starting in 2016. About 3.6% of Michigan children under the age of 6 show elevated lead levels. In the city of Detroit, they've been hit particularly hard. In one zip code in Detroit, 22% of children who were tested showed elevated levels. Today, we're going to talk about why this problem is happening, what it means for our children, and what we can do to make it better. I hope you'll stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legally Speaking. I'm Ashley Lowe, the Chief Executive Officer of Lakeshore Legal Aid. Lakeshore is a nonprofit law firm that provides free civil legal services to low-income people, seniors, and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault throughout the state of Michigan. Today on Legally Speaking, we're talking about lead exposure in housing. And I'm going to be talking with two guests who have worked in this area at two different perspectives. My first guest is Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. Welcome, and thanks so much for being with us.
Honored to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for talking about this critically important issue.
Dr. El-Sayed is a medical doctor, an epidemiologist, a political activist, and an expert in public health. So we're thrilled you're here to inform us today.
Honored to be here.
Thanks. And Todd Pierce-Ryan is a staff attorney at Lakeshore Legal Aid. He works in our Systemic Impact Litigation Unit, and he is focusing his work on lead paint. Todd, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks. So Dr. El-Sayed, I want to talk a little bit about your background, particularly because it's interesting. You got your doctorate in public health at Oxford. You got your medical degree at Columbia. You taught epidemiology at Columbia. You've written hundreds of papers on the academic side, and then you came to Detroit to run the health department. Can you talk about what it was about that position that drew you to the position and to Detroit?
Yeah, so my father immigrated to Detroit back in 1978, and without Wayne State University, a jewel in Michigan's public university system, I might have grown up in a very different place. And the opportunity to come home and help rebuild a department that had been shut down when the city was facing bankruptcy during the 2011-2012 period, that was a unique opportunity to really think about how we build out a health department that can engage in creating the kind of space where people can be their healthiest. Now, the thing about public health is very different than medicine. Medicine is the art and science of diagnosing and treating disease in individuals. Sometimes we think that if we do a lot of medicine, we're doing public health. That's just doing a lot of medicine. Public health is about places. It's about creating the environments where people can be their healthiest. And that's the critical role of a health department. It's something that government has been doing for a very long time, all the way back when government was involved in making sure that we had basic sanitary water to prevent us from getting the kinds of diseases that killed so many people back before we had things like antibiotics and vaccines. And still today, we take for granted that those sanitation systems are really what keep us healthy, making sure that we're flushing away the bad water and getting clean water in. And so public health today really is a lot more focused on how do we prevent the kinds of diseases that affect people into their lives. And in a place like Detroit, we really got to focus on young people. Our children face threefold the probability of being hospitalized for asthma, fourfold the probability of being exposed to lead than the state average. And the infant mortality rate in Detroit is in fact higher than it is in my father's native Egypt. And so we had a lot of work to do, lead being one of those chief issues that we wanted to handle.
Right, so let's talk about lead. I think it's safe to say that before the Flint water crisis, lead was really not on the public's radar. And clearly, it is a problem that we should be looking at. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background. Why are children being exposed in their homes, and why are they particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, I want to talk first a little bit about what lead is. It is a divalent cationic metal, which is just to say that it looks a lot like calcium in the body, calcium and magnesium and even zinc. And so it masquerades itself as these other metals that are so critical in our bodies. I mean, most of our bones are made out of calcium. Magnesium and zinc are critical for our brain function. And so it masquerades itself in the body and then outcompetes those other metals. And so it hangs out in the body for a long period of time it causes all kinds of havoc in cells. But the important issue is what it does in developing brain cells. That's why it's so important for us to understand who's affected by it and to address it in our environments, because what it does is it has a long-term impact on a child's cognitive ability. And so lead is not naturally occurring. It doesn't just happen in the world. It's not something that you can just be walking around the woods and get exposed to lead. It's something that we put there. And it's been happening for a very long time. In fact, if you go back to ancient Rome, they didn't quite know how dangerous it was. And so we hear a lot about the Roman aqueducts, and those were lined with lead. And there are some historians who even argue that the fall of Rome was because of mass lead poisoning, putting it everywhere. Today, the big places where we're worried about lead are in piping, but more so in lead-based paint in homes. Back when I was a kid, it commonly added to gasoline, but thanks to a lot of good public health work and advocacy, we don't do leaded gasoline anymore.
And lead paint too, right? That's been banned for years.
Exactly. It's been banned for years, but you and I both know that a lot of people live in older homes. And so if a home was built before 1978, when lead-based paint was banned, it's highly likely that there's lead somewhere in the paint in a home. Because a lot of times when you want to repaint the housing, the house, you don't take the paint out, right? You just paint over it. And so in homes built before 1978, there's a high probability that there's going to be some lead in the base paint there. And what's worse is sometimes when those homes are not in the best state of repair, that lead-based paint can chip off. Now, here's the worst thing about it. Remember I told you about Rome?
Right.
One of the things they used to do with lead was they used to use it to flavor their wine, because lead is sweet to the taste. And so when you have children crawling around in a little space and they see the lead dust, when they put their hands to their mouth, it tastes sweet. And so they do it again. And that's principally why we have such a serious lead epidemic. Now, I want to point to that 2016 number that you mentioned. One of the important outcomes of the Flint water crisis, which was just devastating for people in the city of Flint, was that it brought lead poisoning back to the front of our brains. And now people are realizing all the damage that's possible because of lead, and so more people are testing, which is a good thing. But what's happening is that people who otherwise might not have been tested are now testing, and so we're seeing a lot of the cases that would have gone missing, that we would have missed in the past, they're coming to the fore. That gives us a clear opportunity right now to make sure that kids who are being affected get the care that they need and stand up and think a little bit about what we can do as a society to get the lead out of hazards away for our children.
Dr. El-Sayed, why Detroit? Why is Detroit hit particularly hard with these elevated levels?
Yeah, so remember I told you if a house was built before 1978, high probability that there's lead there. And unfortunately, Detroit's an extremely poor city. The consequences of marginalization and structural racism have created a deep level of embedded poverty in a community like Detroit. And so you have these homes that are older, and then you also find that they tend to be more likely to be in a state of disrepair. In fact, 93% of Detroit's housing stock was built before 1978. And so a high proportion of that, beyond the fact that it's old housing and people tend to be a bit poorer in a community like Detroit, oftentimes people rent. And so the incentive and the capacity that they have to get that leaded paint out of the walls goes away. And unfortunately, while there are some landlords who are quite responsible, many are not. And they see the opportunity to simply just let a house be as it is and then move people through it. And so we have a juxtaposition, a nexus between a number of different trends that lands itself in communities like Detroit, leaving certain zip codes with a lead prevalence of near 20%.
And if I may just briefly,
of course,
with the rental housing in particular, that there's an increased risk of lead poisoning of children in rental housing versus owner-occupied. And there's been a trend in the city of Detroit away from owner-occupied. There are more renters now than owner-occupied, and that's resulting in a massive loss of African-American home ownership in particular, with its own set of problems, but then there'd be a corresponding increase in the risks of lead poisoning of children due to the increase in rental housing in the city of Detroit.
Thanks for that, Todd. Dr. El-Sayed, can you talk a little bit more about how would somebody know if their children had been poisoned by lead? What's it look like?
The problem is that you can't know immediately. The thing about lead is unless it's really, really high, you don't usually see symptoms. It's somewhat silent. The critical thing that people can do is to have their children tested. It's a simple test. It's just a little finger prick. While usually at the first year and second year checkups, a lead test is done just as a matter of course, anybody who's potentially worried based on the housing that they live in, based on some sense that there might have been some exposure, can go either to a local health department or to their pediatrician's office and ask for a lead test. It's a pretty simple thing to get done. It results pretty quickly, and folks can have the peace of mind of having known. But that's the challenge of lead. For most people, unless it's an extremely high lead level, it doesn't really cause symptoms now. But even if it's not causing symptoms today, the long-term consequences of lead exposure can be serious. And so you might miss it today. You might not know that your kid was affected because you just didn't get tested or they didn't have symptoms. But doesn't mean that the long-term consequences aren't going to be there. And so it's critical that folks living in housing built before 1978, folks who, if any other child in the family tested positive, if there is even in certain communities where the lead prevalence is really high, that folks make it a priority to go and get tested. You can either go to the health department, that'll do it quickly, or right to your pediatrician's office.
So it's easy enough to do. It's
easy enough to do. Unfortunately, it's not top of mind for a lot of folks, right? Because it's something you cannot see. And it doesn't show symptoms. And so, most of the time, if there's nothing quote unquote wrong, right, then we don't go looking for something. But lead is one of those things that can be going wrong in the background, even if we're missing it right now. And so it really is critical for children aged 1 or 2 years old to make sure that they have an annual lead screen. And if there's any reason why a child could have been exposed, that's critical. Also, one of the things to remember is that sometimes kids get their care not in the house that they live in, right? So maybe they'll go to grandma's house for the day. And even if that house was built after 1978, grandma's house might have been built before it, and a kid could be exposed there. And so if a child spends any time at all in a home that has a high probability of having lead in the walls, it's really critical to get tested.
Right, that's a really good point. Todd, I want to talk about the legal side and kind of what the lay of the land is. But first I want to talk about your background. You have been you were in the Legal Aid Bureau when you were in law school. You've worked in complex litigation in the private side. But before you went to law school, you were both an AmeriCorps member and the executive director of a Habitat for Humanity. And I'm wondering, does that relationship that you have with Habitat and that experience, does that inform the work you're doing now in housing?
Absolutely, it does. So I grew up on a dirt road in rural Michigan between Lansing and Flint, working class parents. I grew up working construction. I worked construction through summers at University of Michigan. After graduation, I went and worked with Habitat for Humanity. So I've built houses with my own hands. I've designed houses. I've worked on renovation of houses. And so that absolutely gives me a thorough understanding of the practical problems involved with home construction, as well as the practical solutions that are at hand. So Habitat for Humanity is a great nonprofit, builds houses, works in partnership with low-income people to secure home ownership in the long term. I actually got trained on lead-safe practices while I was with Habitat for Humanity. We made a point of it because we were getting into more house renovations after the housing crisis here in Michigan. And there's a federal law that actually requires contractors to have lead-safe training if they're going to disturb paint in homes. There's a lot of non-compliance with that. There's a lot of people who don't follow that law. But all those, I was with Habitat for 6 years, so those years working construction and also from a management perspective, running a nonprofit, inform how we can attack this problem of lead hazards in housing.
Todd, you mentioned federal law that has requirements on contractors. What are the laws that are designed to protect people from lead exposure?
So there's various laws at various levels. So without getting too complicated with it, there's federal laws that apply nationwide. There's state laws that apply across the state of Michigan. And then there's city laws that will apply in the local city or municipality, townships, counties where you live. And an example of the federal law is there's a disclosure requirement that landlord is required to disclose the presence of lead-based paint in a home, as well as reports. So if a landlord has had the home tested, they're required to provide that to a tenant. There's also the federal law controlling the safety of contractors doing work in homes, because the important thing is that the lead is not exposed directly to the children. And so you can do lead-safe work practices to avoid that exposure. If you're opening up a kitchen, you can expose the family living there to lead hazards. The state and local governments also have these laws. I'm going a little long with my answer, but the state of Michigan actually has some criminal penalties that may apply to a landlord who's renting a property to a child that has a certain level of lead poisoning and then refuses to abate the lead hazards within 90 days. And then the state law is consistent across the cities. The city of Detroit has a local ordinance that requires landlords to inspect for and abate lead hazards prior to renting it. That's been on the books for years. That's not a recent law, but by and large, landlords in the city of Detroit have not complied with it. Over 95% of landlords have not complied with that law.
So Todd, you raised a really good point. What does a tenant do? What if somebody is renting in the city of Detroit and they think their landlord hasn't tested? What can they do?
Well, the first and most important thing, as Dr. El-Sayed said, get your child tested. Know what the information is. There are some medical interventions that can be useful as well. First and foremost, protect your child. Know the information. Second thing is to protect your child from the lead in the home. Once you know that information, what do you do with it? So you can take interim control measures, and there's nurses with the state of Michigan, there's nurses with the Detroit Health Department that actually reach out to families and instruct them on how to do temporary things to protect your family. And then you can request and require the landlord to actually address the problem. And that's where legal aid comes in, because there are concerns about landlord retaliation against tenants. It is against the law, but from a practical standpoint, it does occur. And many people do not have an attorney. Most tenants do not have an attorney to help them in this process.
So Todd, what kind of work have you been doing on the attorney side? What have you been doing in representing clients who are facing these issues?
So we represent clients in suing for repairs and for damages. So the repairs are to address the lead hazards in the home. We have a child with lead poisoning. We have a house with documented lead hazards that are an active danger to the family living there. We sue and ask a judge to order the landlord to make repairs. They've already violated the law in the city of Detroit by not doing it before renting the property. They're violating the law after getting notice from the tenant or from Lakeshore that the child has lead poisoning living in their property, and they're continuing to violate it by failing to repair the property. So that's the first thing, is try to help the child immediately through repairing the property in a safe manner. Again, the landlord cannot do this work on their own. A lot of people try, but if you go in and start scraping the chipped paint, you're generating more hazards. It has to be done in the right way. There are resources to help landlords do this. There's information available with the state of Michigan, with the federal government, but the important thing is to work through a licensed lead abatement contractor. Okay. The second part of it, we sue for money. So there's a family, we represent the parent only. We don't represent the child on personal injury cases. There are private attorneys who might take that on. But we represent the parent who's going through the experience of living in a house that's poisoning their child. Mm-hmm. They're going through an experience of doing what they can to protect the child in the home, but the landlord's refusing to repair it. How does that feel? What kind of damage does that cause? And there's no way to fix it. We can't turn back the clock and make that not happen. That's what the parent wants. But we can bring money damages, and that then hopefully changes the landlord's practices moving forward, because we're impacting their bottom line. And these landlords are running a business. And so we want to show the landlords the cost of running that business in a way that poisons children.
Okay. And so there's lawsuits you can bring either in defense of a landlord-tenant action or affirmative cases. Is there other work that you're doing? Are you working with city officials or other things to try and move the needle on these cases?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of different people and organizations that are involved with this work. So in Detroit, there's the Detroit Lead Enforcement Work Group. It's a coalition of different nonprofits like ClearCore that's active in Detroit, the City Health Department, the city's Health and Safety Code Department, BSEED is what it's called in Detroit. There's a policy group from Lansing that comes down. There's a lot of different people involved. There's Wayne State University, Dr. Like Thompson. There's groups that go out door knocking, telling people, hey, you're in a zip code that's got an elevated risk of lead, we can do not an official lead test, but a swab and let you know if we detect lead hazards. There's a lot of people involved. We are a small piece of it where we can do a particular thing. We're attorneys, we can represent this client with this, and we can potentially help swing the needle with landlords. But there's a ton of boots on the ground doing a lot of great work on this topic, but it's a really extensive problem, particularly in the city of Detroit.
Dr. El-Sayed, I know you, when you were at the health department, you put together a task force about demolition and health. And can you talk about that, why you formed that task force?
It actually emerged from the lead enforcement work group that we had put together when I was there, and I'm really thankful that that's persisted, because one of the biggest challenges that we found was that a lot of families just wouldn't get tested because they were afraid of what the retribution from their landlords would look like. And so I'm really thankful that Lakeshore is involved, and that group has burgeoned out to think about all of the different ways that we can provide families support, both preemptively and then after a child may test positive. One of the things that we found coming out of that was that one of the lead nurses had said something based on, there were some anecdotal arguments that it's possible that when a home was demolished, because there was lead-based paint in the walls of that home, that it could be allowing the fugitive dust out into the air and potentially increasing the probability that a child close to that area might be exposed to lead. And one of the lead nurses that worked with the department suggested that there was a family where two of the children had tested positive, and then there was a demolition right next door. And at that point I said, we really need to bring some science to this question. And so we put together a study trying to ask, what is the probability that a child living within a couple hundred feet of a demolition, what is the added probability that that child is then going to have a positive lead test, based on the mechanism of exposure where you have this fugitive dust released. And lo and behold, we found that there was an increased risk, particularly in the summer months, when families are liable to have the windows open, for example, or children may be playing outside. Okay. And so once we realized that that was an issue, we realized we had to do something about it. And to their credit, the land bank and other organizations involved in the demolition process had really thought through what the best way to prevent fugitive dust release might look like. The problem is that nobody has ever demolished homes at the scale that the city of Detroit has. Mm-hmm. And so it's plausible that, if you're demolishing one or two homes, you may engage a protocol and it might work. But if you're doing hundreds, thousands of homes, then you may need to rethink the protocol. And so we thought about what we could do before, during, and after a demolition to bring down that likelihood that a child neighboring or within a particular vicinity could be exposed. And so that work I know is ongoing, but it was really critical for us to put the science out there, and then to think very critically about how we engage what is available evidence about how best to prevent children from being exposed, and to think a little bit about how we might change the protocols before, during, and after a demolition.
Right. So are there places that we should refer folks to if they need information about lead poisoning or lead exposure? Is there a resource out there that we can share with the public?
I think the best single place to go is your local health department. Whether it is, if you're in the city of Detroit, that's a Detroit Health Department. If you're outside of Detroit but in Wayne County, that's the Wayne County Health Department. And then if you're in Macomb or Oakland, that's your county health department. And having a conversation with somebody on the lead team, they can help orient you to all of the resources available. If you're just sort of interested in perusing and learning on your own, the CDC maintains a great website about lead hazards and lead poisoning and about what you can do about it. And if your child has been exposed, the person to talk to right then and there is your child's pediatrician, and they can help support you about what to do next. In most cases, preventing more lead poisoning is the way to go, and making sure that a kid has access to green leafy vegetables and in a stimulating cognitive environment. That's the best thing they can do. And in some circumstances, unfortunately, if a child's poisoning is bad enough, they may need to be cared for in a hospital. But your pediatrician is the person who can orient you and engage you. But there are a lot of resources available, and the most important thing is not to ignore it. If your child hasn't been tested, test them. If they've been tested and they've tested positive, have a conversation with the people who can help you. There are resources available. It's just really important, even if you don't see symptoms now, it's really, really important that over the long term, you can do what you can now so that you can prevent the long-term cognitive challenges that may come with that.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks. We've been talking today with Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, who is a public health advocate and a progressive activist, and Todd Pierce-Ryan, who's an attorney at Lakeshore Legal Aid. Thanks so much for helping us to really understand this issue about lead paint and what we can do about it, both on an individual level and really on a systemic issue. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your work and your advocacy. We really appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. And thanks for joining us on Legally Speaking.